Good afternoon and welcome to today's Georgetown Alumni webinar hosted by the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you for taking time out of your day to connect virtually with fellow Hoyas for today's program, Educational Equality in the Age of COVID-19 with Professor Douglas Reed. Douglas Reed is currently a professor of government at Georgetown University, where he is also the founding director of the master's program in educational transformation. Reed's research interests center on the politics of education, educational policy making, federalism, and judicial politics. He is the author of Building the Federal Schoolhouse, Localism and the American Education State, and On Equal Terms, the Constitutional Politics of Educational Opportunity. His current research focuses on the legal notions of race, equality, and colorblindness, and how educational policy can improve student outcomes by directly addressing the racial contexts and experiences of students. During the 2013 to 2014 years, Reed was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He has also been an Advanced Studies Fellow at Brown University and was named a Carnegie Scholar by the Carnegie Corporation, as well as a National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow. Reed received his Ph.D. in Political Science from Yale University. I'm Kelly Young, Associate Director of Strategic Engagement and Alumni Relations, and I'll be facilitating today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few tips and reminders. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel within 48 hours of today's broadcast. You will receive the link to the recording in our follow-up email. Professor Reed will answer questions towards the end of the presentation. Please send in your questions using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. If you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please also submit those concerns via the questions section of the control panel. Without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Professor Reed.
Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate the introduction. I hope everyone is doing well and is safe, and all of your friends and family are doing well in what is clearly a challenging time for the United States. Today, I'm going to be talking about educational equity or equality in the age of COVID-19. And I just first want to start with a little bit about what the talk's going to be all about today, to sort of give you the 30,000-foot picture here. First, I'll just talk a little bit about who I am, what I do at Georgetown, and what my current research is on. We'll talk about the central question for what we're going to talk about today. And as we move into that question, I want to talk about a couple of different dimensions of inequality within the COVID era. I'm going to draw on what's referred to as the summer slide or the summer setback literature. And I also want to talk a little bit about what we know from the digital divide literature and how that affects what's going on with student learning. And then some broader lessons that we've learned from the Great Recession, 2008-2010 period roughly, and how that affected educational outcomes. And then think very briefly about what school districts are currently doing or thinking about doing. And where a policy response might be appropriate given where we're at. So if you have any questions along the way, please just pop them into the chat with Kelly, and we'll go over the questions at the end. Welcome any and all comments or questions. So, and I really appreciate you being here today as we think about ways in which the current situation is affecting outcomes for students. So I'm a professor in the government department. A few years ago, I've started a program called the MA program in educational transformation at Georgetown University, together with the assistant director, Professor Sabrina Wesley-Nero. We launched this program in an effort to ensure that professionals who are going out into the field of education really had a good grasp both of what effective pedagogies look like if they wanted to become a teacher, but also what effective advocacy and policy looks like. So we have two concentrations, one in teacher preparation and one in advocacy and policy. And we are the first accredited teacher preparation program at Georgetown. My own research is on race and federalism. I look at constitutional issues regarding school integration. I also study the local politics of education. The thing we want to focus on today is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. How will the COVID-19 era affect educational quality within the United States in the near and medium term? There's a short and simple answer to that we'll get to. The short run answer and the medium run answer are roughly the same. COVID-19 is going to dramatically worsen already pre-existing inequalities, and I'll talk about why that's probably going to be the case in a few minutes here. The more complicated answer is we do have space within public policy to influence that outcome. And if we make some choices and make some investments, we can actually establish a foundation for greater equality over the longer term. This is not a set in stone outcome. There are a range of options available. Some are better than others in terms of thinking about educational quality. Okay, so first I want to focus on what's referred to in the literature in education as either summer setback or summer slide. The basic idea is pretty simple. When kids don't go to school, they forget stuff. And that happens over a 3-month period. It's not necessarily in terms of their own educational progress, it's not a permanent loss, but the test scores show that what happens in the fall is significantly or substantially lower than what happened in the spring. The complicating idea in all of this isn't evenly applied, or summer slide doesn't affect all students equally. So the complicating idea is that different kids forget stuff at different rates, and they also forget different things, right? So summer slide or setback, it's been studied for a long time, and it really does manifest itself as lower achievement in the fall, particularly in math. Math is the area where students suffer biggest setback. Reading is more variable. And reading has more of a class dimension than math does. Not too many households do summertime math projects to keep things going. A lot of households do engage in sort of summer reading that keeps reading skills more sharply honed for some students than others. But what's important to realize is that that loss in summer setback is not evenly distributed. We know that children in low-income households and in households with lower educational levels have greater levels of summer setback. So that's sort of the backdrop that we're looking at every year, right? This is a recurring thing, and schools have strategies to respond to those. The question for us is, how is COVID-19 going to affect us? One possible plus in all of this is that from the literature on summer setback, we know that kids recover their loss actually pretty quickly, right? In a couple, 2 or 3 months, they're back to where they were. But going forward, what's going to happen come September? What we do know is that school districts closed very rapidly in mid-March, ranged from roughly March 16th to March 24th. And that created what amounts to a 6-month suspension of regular school. The shift to online learning across the United States was highly variable and uneven. Some districts had a capacity to relatively simply transfer learning into an online environment. Others were Xeroxing packets and having parents drive by to pick them up. What we do know is that the shift to online learning is not always very successful for younger students. There are a number of studies of online charter schools, and particularly in math, where the results are poor. In one study of online charter schools in Pennsylvania, students actually wound up performing a year lower by virtue of attending an online charter school, a year lower in math achievement. So online learning has a mixed track record. But the key question is, what should we expect come September if schools are able to reopen then? So Megan Kufield and James Holland did an estimate. This came out in April of what this would look like. Let's assume that what happens from March until September is like a regular summer, and that there's no learning happening beginning in March, right? So this chart shows math standardized test scores on what's called a MAP assessment that's offered by Northwest Associates. It's a well-regarded exam that is used throughout the country to sort of benchmark where students are at. And so they have an inventory of test results that they can draw on here and look at past performance of what the typical slide is from the last day of school until September 1. So the right-hand side of the chart over here shows what the summer slide looks like in 3rd through 8th grade normally, okay, those solid colored lines. What you'll see is that the summer slide is more acute in the younger grades because they have less of a reservoir of learning to draw from, but it happens in all grades. But if we look at these dashed lines, so if we assume that the school closure that occurred in mid-March leads to a slide across the entire 6-month period from March until September, what we see are some pretty dramatic estimates based on previous test scores, and assuming that that loss is linear, we see some pretty dramatic test scores, particularly for 3rd and 4th grades. So I want to draw your attention to this 4th grade dashed line here, right? So if we assume that no learning occurred after March 15th, by the time we get to September 1, 4th graders will be roughly where 3rd graders would be in a normal year of summer setback, okay? So the 4th grade has lost literally a full year of learning based on this estimate of mathematics. So that's a pretty dramatic regression for these younger students. And if we assume these lines are roughly parallel here, we don't have test scores for 1st through 2nd graders, so 3rd grade is the 1st grade of which we generally test. But it looks like that they're roughly also about a year behind for 3rd graders as well. Reading is not as dramatic, although it's still pretty significant. The dashed lines show that there's some lower levels of accomplishment than what we would want, clearly, a significant drop off. 8th graders don't really change that much. Their reading skills are pretty robust. It's these 3rd and 4th graders that are going to be perhaps most vulnerable to reading summer loss. Okay, so I want you to go back to that complicating idea, because what I just showed you was the entire sample that these researchers were drawing from, took the entire population of test takers in the United States. But if you remember the complicating idea that different kids forget stuff at different rates, we're going to have some additional areas of concern. So it's not just the aggregate level of summer loss that we need to be concerned about, but differences among groups, okay? That previous projection assumed that for all practical purposes, all kids basically stopped learning in mid-March. Some districts, however, maintained or made an effort to maintain academic progress, either with online instruction or parent-led homeschooling with packets. There were wildly uneven responses to the COVID-19 outbreak in terms of online learning. There was a spectacular failure of online learning in Fairfax County, Virginia, just outside the DC area. Multiple efforts to try and mount an online learning platform that resulted in Zoom bombing and graffiti being put on teachers' Zoom accounts. The plug was pulled and heads rolled within Fairfax County. In contrast, Arlington County, just adjacent to Fairfax and just across the river from Georgetown, they basically said, we're not going to teach any new material after March 15th. So it was all review. They basically put a hold on any additional material because they couldn't be confident that all students had access to the technologies that would enable them to teach. So even in affluent, and these are both highly capable, highly affluent districts, had some pretty significant differences in outcomes. So we want to pay attention to how these differences in response affect different groups of children. Okay, one piece in all of this is what we know about the digital divide, okay? Not every household has access to broadband use or broadband internet, right? So this chart from the Pew Research Center tracks broadband availability in the United States by race. And what we see is that African Americans, actually Hispanics, I'm sorry, are at the lowest end of the broadband availability chart. About 50 to 55% of Hispanic households have access to broadband, whereas in contrast, white households, about 75% have access to broadband internet. African Americans have also are significantly lower than white households. When we look at class, the differences are even more sharp. Okay, so in poor households below $30,000 a year, only half of those households have any access to broadband, and that includes smartphone use, right? So a lot of schools were relying on either tablets or smartphones for students to be doing their homework on rather than a full laptop. So even if you count in this device broadband access, for low-income households, there's a significant difference about their availability to utilize these platforms. In contrast, households that have over $75,000 a year in income, they're around the 90% mark for broadband availability. So that digital divide, in just mere descriptive terms, in terms of whether they can turn on a computer to get these materials, represents a huge gulf for both low-income households and, to a lesser extent, racial minorities. What this means is that we've got a multiplying set of inequalities, right? So if we link what we know about summer setback and combine that with digital divide, we can make some inferences that both we should probably be studying in terms of research, but also as we build policy, right? So we have a pretty clear sense based on access to broadband and previous summer setback literature that low-income students are going to have much less exposure to learning and basically will be on that 6-month hiatus that we showed earlier, okay? Similarly, African-American Hispanic students are going to have lower access to curriculum. And if we think intersectionally about the combination of low-income African-American neighborhoods and families, and again, this is independent of any of the direct disease effects of COVID-19, that is, families that are going through loss because of greater impacts of illness and death because of COVID-19, and also recessionary effects. Independent of those two things, we can be pretty confident that there's going to be roughly about a 1-year lag for African-American low-income children from where they would have been last year, and that's significantly lower already than upper or more affluent white households. It's going to be about a year roughly in math and about 6 months in reading, okay? What we also have to combine with all of this is thinking about how the Great Recession and increasing levels of unemployment are going to compound these other two dimensions of inequality, right? So in general, poverty is not good for learning. When a family or household moves into poverty, the learning outcomes are invariably bad. Yeah, axiomatically, when poverty increases, educational outcomes worsen. There was a recent study of the Great Recession that showed that there was significantly reduced math and English language arts achievement, but it wasn't evenly distributed again. The recessionary effect on student achievement was concentrated among school districts serving more economically disadvantaged and minority students. And those districts felt the impacts of the Great Recession in terms of test scores much more acutely. Moreover, there was also differential impact, and this is maybe a little less obvious. Test scores among older students, grades 5 through 7, declined more rapidly than test scores among younger students, which is a little counterintuitive. It may very well be that families were able to buffer younger children from the hardships of unemployment or economic setback, whereas older kids were more aware and felt the stress that accompanied that. Nonetheless, it's clear from the data that older grades in this study of the Great Recession were worse off than younger grades. Also importantly, the outcomes in school districts that laid off a lot of teachers were significantly worse, as were the outcomes in districts that already had high levels of poverty. So when you have high levels of poverty and you're laying off a lot of teachers because of financial distress within that community, those are the groups, the places that are going to be most significantly affected. Okay, so if we put all this together, what we can conclude is that summer setback projections indicate that younger students in poor households will suffer the greatest slide. The effects are going to be clearest for math, but we know that literacy is exceptionally important for that transition in third grade. And that is linked to a number of life outcomes, high school graduation rates, college attendance rates, even rates of incarceration and unemployment can be traced back to ability to read well by third grade. So given the vulnerability of third graders in particular here, the dangers that are confronting that second through fourth grade cohort for readers who are already struggling, they are, if we're going to think about triage, they're the ones who are on a precipice, and the hazards they're facing are acute, and they require immediate intervention. The Great Recession findings indicate that older students are probably going to face a kind of a slower burn. It may not be as apparent in September when we come back, where kids are going to be challenged, but it's clear that the economic turmoil that we're going through as a nation are going to eventually affect those older students as well. The other key in all of this is holding on to teaching staff and maintaining class sizes is key to success on all of this. Okay, so what are school districts doing? As we turn to what policy responses look like, right? This is a survey from Education Week, who surveyed superintendents to see what they wind up doing. The biggest chunk on all of them says, we don't know. We have not yet decided. Was 44% of all superintendents indicated they had no plan to figure out how to make up for lost instructional time. 15% indicated they hadn't lost any instructional time. So that's I think an optimistic or confident assessment of their own online learning platforms. Another full 20% said we're not going to make up any lost instructional time. So it's clear that folks are going to have to just simply move on. 34% had sort of random assessments of what they're going to be doing. But what's most important, I think, from my point of view, is that only 4% were paying attention to what they were going to be doing over the summer. So when asked, how do you plan to make up instructional time lost to coronavirus closures, only 4% of superintendents indicated that they would actually be paying attention to summer school or running additional summer school programs. That part of summer school programs, I think, is really key to building greater long-term equity. There's a policy response that's needed here, and that policy response is really, I think, going to center around moving to year-round schooling for the next 3 to 4 years at a minimum, if we're going to address the kind of gaps that are going to be emerging come September. And I think that year-round schooling, it needs to be in place for grades K through 5, most acutely. Middle schoolers and high schoolers, it's clear that their own summer setback historically has not been as acute, and they seem to probably be able to get through it. So if we had to sort of triage where the greatest need is, I would put it in K through 5. A policy response on this is also needed for ability of school districts to retain teachers and hire additional teachers for that summer instruction. A lot of contracts that are in place may make it very difficult to simply have current set of teachers work over the summer. So you will either need to hire additional teachers or come up with some other mechanism by which the current contractual obligations of districts can be worked around. But it's clear that there needs to be a federal response to attending to the needs of school districts that are undergoing intense fiscal distress. And the pressures to lay off teachers are going to be acute. And in fact, what we really need to be doing is hiring more teachers for summertime instruction. That summertime instruction, there's some research that shows that it works best if it's a combination of enrichment and attention to academic skills. So it needs to be in some ways somewhat a little bit different than the regular academic year. That enrichment piece gets students engaged with learning a little more. They do more project-based learning. They take a more expansive view of out of classroom time. And that combination of enrichment and academic skills can have pretty good payoffs for students. In the short term, the immediate short term, we're in June right now, and we're looking forward, what should be going forward. What we need most fundamentally is an expanded set of summer literacy programs. Not just simply the provision of reading material and books to kids, but also a concerted program of adult-led reading aloud with individual kids, but also comprehension checks. And Professor Kim up at Harvard and his Summer Reads program has an extensive set of studies and literature on the best way to construct these summer literacy programs. And they found that they can basically eliminate summer setback with an organized and coherent provision of access, read aloud efforts, and comprehension checks by adults that are usually parent or even teacher-led. So there are ways to minimize this, and so we need that in the short term. So the irony in some ways is our salvation isn't necessarily going to be in online platforms. In fact, if we get kids off the computer for the summer, if we structure it right, in the short term, we can reduce literacy loss for the fall. That's the end of my presentation. So I look forward to hearing any questions folks might have, and hopefully it's been informative.
Thank you, Professor Reed. We do have a few questions, and just a reminder to everyone who's joined us, if you have a question, please do submit your question via the question section of the control panel. So our first question, these days education should be more globalized, inclusive, and with equal access to all. Poverty translates very differently in the world, especially in the developing world. Do you have any insights or comparisons with the developing world, say Latin America, Africa, or South Asia?
So I think the impacts, the direct impacts of disease, particularly in Latin America, as we see in Brazil and Peru and perhaps to a lesser extent in Chile, those systems are being hit very hard, the healthcare systems. And so in many instances, they're sort of in a fight for survival. We have, although there are differential impacts by race and class in the United States, so far the healthcare system has been able to, at least in terms of intensive care, been able to provide hopefully enough support. In the developing world, this is going to be magnified in terms of years of setback, not months. And I think the challenges in many instances, are, particularly in a place like Brazil, are to be getting social and institutions that are up and running in a way that can actually help people directly. And so I don't have any particular insights in that, because I think the task is much greater because of the depths of poverty in parts of Latin America. I was reading that only 1 out of 3 Peruvian households have running water. That makes the challenge of combating the transmission of COVID-19 all the more challenging. And so it is on a different scale, I think, than in the US.
Okay. We have a number of questions asking about what you think school might look like come September. How will the need for social distancing in the classroom affect the ability to implement year-round schooling? Wealthier districts may have the means to hire teachers to reduce teacher-to-student ratios, while rural districts may have more spacious facilities. Can you talk a little bit to these issues and what you think may happen?
Yeah, and just sort of looking over what school districts are proposing. I mean, the challenge is reducing the density within classrooms, and so what I've been reading in terms of what districts are proposing is either a staggered cohorts where students are in school for 3-4 days a week, or you've got double shifts within a school, so that the first cohort goes from 8 to noon, and the second cohort goes from 1 to 5. What that reduction of density is essential in order to minimize transmission. That the social challenges of having kids who are by nature exuberant, engaging, funny, and in direct physical contact with each other, because that's what it means to be healthy and human. All of that is going to be enormously challenging in terms of managing the transmission. The nature of space in rural areas may open up some possibilities for additional reducing the density more easily. The challenge there is they have less ability to alter their calendar, in the sense of, because transportation times are so much bigger or so much longer, and so doing the double shift is going to be less possible for them. I think what you're going to have to see is every school district is going to have to do a very intense inventory of the assets that they have in an effort to reduce that density. In many instances, it's going to be a continuation of online learning. I am not optimistic that all schools will be open in September. I am optimistic that there will be a partial in-person presence, but that's going to be augmented by days that are online and or staggered schedules. So it's going to be very much a hybrid response, I think, and it's going to be confusing and frustrating. And so patience for everyone is going to be the key word.
Thank you. We are getting a lot of questions at this point. So thank you again for taking the time to do this for our community. Have any school districts done a good job in dealing with COVID?
I'm sure there are, right? So I mean, right now it's hard to sort of organize this systematically to get a sense of what's worked. I think places that have made a real effort to push resources into households that didn't have them, either with the provision of hotspots or opening up internet access through partnerships with internet companies. I think that sort of opened the door to all of this. Those districts that had previously invested in sort of distributed learning models seem to have done pretty well. What's really remarkable, so I'll talk about the areas that I know best, right? So I've done a lot of research in Alexandria, and they already had, as part of a rich portfolio of offerings for high school students, they already had a sort of remote learning distance platform that they were able to shift everybody onto. And Alexandria continued providing new instruction and new material in a way that Arlington, which is generally seen as a more resourced school district, just kind of gave up doing, and which Fairfax County completely fumbled and bumbled. So I think those districts that made a commitment to reaching all of their students and had previously invested in that technology to be able to do that, I think they're going to be in a better position. Alexandria is an example of one of those, but I think it takes that combination of commitment and previous investment.
Okay. To what extent do we need to be rethinking the quote end steps of education, our expectations of children's attainment, including rethinking how we examine students, standardized testing?
Yeah.
Right now we seem to be thinking about how kids can get back to school, but should we be rethinking the eventual goals of education in light of what is achievable?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I agree in a broad sense that accountability systems and standardized testing have really narrowed our definition of goals for education, and broadening that out is a healthy and necessary step. Right now, I think just in terms of getting a kind of quick assessment of who's being harmed, test scores can provide us with some quick indicators. We've suspended accountability tests nationwide for this year. I would urge that they be suspended for the following year as well. And even though that creates a 2-year gap in understanding of where kids are at, it gives us an opportunity to actually rethink some of the fundamentals about education. At Georgetown, we're doing that ourselves, right? So we're going to be in a complicated environment in the fall, where it's going to be most likely a combination of on-campus and online instruction. And so all the faculty are, we're going through a course redesign institutes, and I think we need that on a major level throughout K through 12 education, and greater utilization of experiential learning, greater utilization of project-based learning, all of these things that we can do in a way that avoid the narrowing of our educational horizons. One of the real downsides, and I saw this in the classes I taught this past spring, of an online environment, the Zoom environment, it takes away it minimizes the human element profoundly, and I think we just need to find other ways to maximize that human element, because it's you know, there's a moment where reinvention is going to be, this is a moment for reinvention across the board, both in higher education and in K through 12.
Okay, so building on that, here is a comment and a question. I'm a teacher at a public middle school in Hawaii. We did not give out grades when we moved to online learning, and I lost half of my students because no one wanted to work if they did not receive credit. We were told that we could not grade because of equity in learning environments. What do you think about grading and credit given for online learning?
So ideally, we're creating systems where students are committed to learning because of the intrinsic motivations, not simply the extrinsic motivations. Losing half your students because that grading is no longer really an option or possible is a real loss, because they're not there. And then so I think we need to be able to figure out what taps into students' own motivations and try, and this is part of that reinvention of education. Clearly, external demarcations, when they're gone, don't sustain students' involvement. I see that in higher education as well. And in fact, in the program that I run, there was a conversation at the graduate level about whether we should move to credit, no credit grading. The graduate school as a whole moved to that, but each program could hold on to letter grading. We held on to letter grading precisely for that reason, because we wanted to maintain that connection with our students and make accommodations for them on an individual basis. And so by holding on to letter grading, we were able to sustain that relationship, which sometimes diminishes if it's just a thumbs up or thumbs down and they can walk away from the course. So our goal was to ensure that everyone's whole health was sort of attended to, not just their academic health. True confession, myself, I don't have an undergraduate GPA because I went to a very odd school. So grading has always been a troubling thing for me, but that's just personal confession.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Do you have thoughts on how to handle the questions you raise in light of a public education system, which in many places relies on property taxes for school funding, which typically results in well-funded public schools in wealthy areas and underfunded schools in areas with higher poverty?
Yeah. I've thought a lot about this for a long time. My first book was really on a bunch of court decisions about inequality in school funding and the role of the property tax. What COVID has made manifest and clear is that fragmented, localized systems are by nature unequal, whether that's in healthcare or in education. A national response was needed for a healthcare response that was going to be equitable and fair and sustained. I don't think we've received that yet or experienced that yet. Similarly, in education, I think in moments of stress, the decentralized system that we have exacerbates our inequality. I think the only response that can engage this on a meaningful level is a significant change in school funding that relies on a federal stream of revenue. It could still be controlled locally, but I think there needs to be a series of commitments about what a minimum level of education looks like in the United States. And there was a recent decision out of Detroit, although the decision was vacated by the Sixth Circuit, which said that there is a right to an education based on a minimal access to literacy that Detroit students were not receiving. So we need to have that national conversation about what that minimum level is, and that needs to be funded by the federal government, in my view.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Reed, for taking the time to present to our community, and thank you all for joining us today and participating in this discussion. Please look out for our follow-up email, which will include information on upcoming programs, as well as a feedback survey and a link to today's recording.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Be safe. Be